The Hollow Nexus wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. It occupied a carefully neutral slice of space where 3 territorial borders met, and none of the involved parties wanted to admit they couldn't control it, which made it perfect for the sort of business that thrived in legal gray zones: smuggling, information brokering, and the particular flavor of blood sport entertainment that required participants to sign liability waivers in 17 languages. Zixthar had been running the gambling parlor on the station's lower deck for 6 cycles, and he'd seen enough stupidity to fill a cargo freighter. But this was different. "She can't be serious," he muttered, his 3 eye stalks swiveling to track the figure leaning against his counter. The human, because of course it was a human, examined her fingernails with the kind of casual disinterest usually reserved for weather reports. "Dead serious. My ship, my cargo, everything. Against your house odds on the Crucible. A Vryn delegate at the nearest table choked on her crystallized neurotoxin. You understand what you're proposing? The Kethrin Crucible has a 6% survival rate. 6. And those survivors were Kravik warlords, Than champions, species bred for... Yeah, bred for war. Genetic superiority, cultural emphasis on combat prowess." The human waved a hand dismissively. "Heard the speech. Still boring. Are we doing this, or am I taking my currency elsewhere?" Zixthar's secondary brain, the one that handled risk assessment, was screaming warnings. His primary brain, the one that calculated profit margins, was doing some very interesting mathematics. "You comprehend that 73% of fatalities occur in the first chamber alone? The trial adapts to exploit species-specific vulnerabilities. It will learn what terrifies your kind and what? Kill me?" The human smiled, and Zixthar felt his circulatory fluid run cold. He'd seen that expression before, on creatures that had stopped caring whether they lived or died. Except this one didn't have the hollow look of someone seeking death. She looked like she was already composing the story she'd tell afterward. "The Terran makes a valid point about expanding her options," came a gravelly voice from the corner. Mordak, a Kravik who'd lost half his face to the Crucible 12 years ago, leaned forward. "Though I confess curiosity about what makes her believe she'll succeed where my brethren failed." "I don't believe I'll succeed." The human turned, giving Mordak her full attention. "I just think it'll be more interesting than hauling grain shipments to the outer colonies. Plus, someone at the last station said humans wouldn't dare attempt it, and well..." She shrugged. "Here we are." The parlor had gone quiet. Not the expectant hush before violence, but the stunned silence of beings collectively reconsidering their understanding of cause and effect. "You're risking your life," said a Fen trader, her wing membranes fluttering in agitation, "because someone suggested your species lacked courage." "Courage?" The human laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "No, courage would be doing it for something important. This is spite. Completely different motivation." Zixthar should have refused. Every regulatory protocol suggested refusing. But the crowd was already pressing closer, and he could see credit chips appearing in multiple appendages. The house would make a fortune on betting alone, even if, when, the human died in the first chamber. Very well. He initiated the contract protocols, watching biometric data scroll across his display. Human. Female designation, though he'd learned that meant less for Terrans than for most species. No military enhancements, no genetic modifications, no cybernetic upgrades beyond standard translation implants. Just baseline human, whatever that meant. Standard rules apply. You'll have access to basic equipment, one weapon of your choosing, and whatever supplies you can carry. The trial begins when you enter the first chamber and ends when you either exit the final gate or your vital signs cease. Cheerful. She pressed her thumb to the contract pad. Where's the entrance? Sub-level 9, section 42. There's a preparation room where... Yeah, I'll find it. She was already walking toward the exit, moving with the loose-limbed ease of someone who either had absolute confidence or had made peace with oblivion. Zixthar genuinely couldn't tell which. Mordak rose to follow her. Terran. A word. She paused, glancing back. The Crucible was designed by the Kethran Ascendancy during their war phase. They believed that true warriors were forged through impossible trials. The challenges inside, they're not merely physical. The final chamber. He hesitated, his remaining eye distant with memory. It shows you what you fear most and makes you choose between everything you are and survival itself. I chose survival. Lost half my face and all of my honor. Sounds traumatic. The human's expression didn't change. Thanks for the warning. You mock, but I don't mock. I genuinely appreciate the information. She tilted her head. Question, though. Did anyone ever just refuse to choose? Mordak blinked. The trial doesn't offer that option. Huh. The human smiled again, wider this time. Guess we'll see. She left, and the parlor erupted in overlapping voices. Zixthar ignored them, already setting up the viewing feeds. The Crucible broadcast on encrypted channels, primitive technology by modern standards, but the Kethrans had wanted witnesses to their warriors' triumphs or failures. Now it served a different purpose. Taking bets on time of death, he announced. Subdivided pools for method of termination. Additional odds on whether she screams. The Vryn delegate pushed forward. 5,000 credits says she doesn't make it past the entry tunnel. Psychological break within the first chamber, called a Than merchant. 3,000. Mordak remained seated, staring at the empty doorway. What motivates a creature to walk into certain death for such a trivial reason? Pride, suggested someone. Insanity, offered another. A small figure emerged from the back. Pel, a Kethran scholar, one of the few survivors of that ancient race. Her species had abandoned the practice of trials millennia ago, deeming them barbaric remnants of a shameful past. But she studied them still, trying to understand what her ancestors had been. Neither, Pel said quietly, or perhaps both. The Crucible was designed for species that fight because they must, for territory, for hierarchy, for genetic imperatives. We never considered what might happen if someone entered who fights because they choose to, who could stop at any moment but won't, simply because stopping would be less interesting than continuing. That's madness, the Vryn delegate said. Yes. Pel's eyes reflected the glow of the viewing screens as they activated, showing the human entering the preparation chamber. But it's a very specific kind of madness. And I'm not certain our ancestors prepared for it. On screen, the human was selecting equipment with the focused efficiency of someone choosing vegetables at a market. A standard plasma cutter, mid-grade, nothing fancy. A breacher's suit, lightweight, flexible, basic medical supplies, and curiously, a datapad and stylus. Why would she need recording equipment? Zixthar wondered aloud. The human looked up then, directly at the camera, as if she'd heard the question. She winked. Then she walked toward the entrance of the Kethran Crucible, whistling something that the translation implants identified as an ancient Terran song about storm survival. The betting intensified. The screens glowed brighter. And somewhere in the depths of Sub-Level 9, a trial designed to break the greatest warriors in galactic history woke up to meet something it had never encountered before. A human who wasn't there to prove anything, except that she could be. The odds, Zixthar reflected, had just become meaningless. The first chamber materialized around her like a bad memory gaining substance. Most species experienced the Crucible as a physical space. Corridors, traps, obstacles to overcome through strength or skill. The human saw it differently, or so the biometric readings suggested. Her heart rate remained steady. Her pupils dilated with interest, not fear. And when the walls began bleeding memories of Earth's worst moments, cities burning, oceans rising, the desperate scramble of extinction events, she laughed. "Oh, we're doing environmental trauma? Cute." Pell watched from the observation deck, her ancient fingers tracing patterns on the console. Impossible. The Crucible accesses deep psychological imprints. It should be showing her species' collective nightmares. "It is," said Krev, a Than security specialist who'd made a career studying human behavioral patterns. "She's just not reacting correctly. Look at her neural patterns. She's compartmentalizing, treating the images like historical data instead of visceral threats." On screen, the human was taking notes on her datapad while walking through a simulation of atmospheric collapse. She paused to sketch something, then continued forward as gravity inverted and the ceiling became the floor. "Fascinating adaptation of the gravity trap sequence," she said to no one in particular. "Kethrans must have fought species with different spatial orientations. Wonder if they ever encountered the Zix Collective. Their vertical cities would make this whole inversion thing pretty standard." Is she analyzing the trial while taking it? The Vryn delegate sounded offended, as if the human were insulting the Crucible by refusing to take it seriously. "Worse." Mordak leaned closer to the screen. "She's learning from it." "Watch." She just marked that pressure plate before triggering it deliberately. She wanted to see what it did. The plate activated, and the chamber filled with a neural toxin specifically calibrated for mammals. The human coughed, stumbled, then pulled a breather from her pack with the annoyed efficiency of someone dealing with a minor inconvenience. She scribbled another note. "Toxin dispersal pattern suggests central ventilation. Structural weakness if you needed to disable the system." Kethrans really loved their symmetry. "She's writing a review," Zixthar said, disbelief coloring his voice. "She's in a death trap and she's writing a technical review." The second chamber loaded faster than it should have, as if the Crucible itself were becoming impatient. This one targeted isolation, a specialty of Kethran psychological warfare. Participants found themselves in absolute darkness, cut off from all sensory input except the sound of their own breathing growing louder, distorting, until it sounded like something hunting them. The human sat down cross-legged in the darkness and started singing. Not screaming, not praying. Singing some atonal Terran melody about broken hearts and bad decisions, her voice echoing off walls that might not even exist. "What is she doing?" demanded a Fen observer who'd wagered considerably on psychological breakdown. Krev consulted his database of human behaviors. "It's called coping?" "No, wait. Defiance through cultural expression. Humans often respond to existential threat by creating art or noise. It's a dominance display against the void itself." "That's the stupidest survival mechanism I've ever heard," someone muttered. "And yet," Pell observed, "it's working." The darkness retreated, perhaps confused, perhaps simply moving to the next programmed sequence. The human stood, brushed off her suit, and kept walking. Third chamber. Physical endurance. A corridor that extended for what should have been kilometers, each step requiring exponentially more effort than the last. Gravity multiplied. Temperature fluctuated from freezing to boiling. The air thickened until breathing felt like drowning. She made it 20 meters before collapsing. "There," the Vryn delegate said with satisfaction. "Finally, biological limits." But the human wasn't dying. She was laughing again, face down on the floor, shoulders shaking with genuine amusement. "Of course, She wheezed between breaths. Of course you'd make it literally uphill both ways. That's perfect. That's beautiful design, actually. Make the metaphor literal. Trials of strength as actual physical ascension. Did the Kethrans appreciate irony, or was this accidental? She rolled onto her back, staring at a ceiling that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, probably meant to be hypnotic or disorienting. Instead, she watched them like someone studying clouds. The human is broken, Mordak said, though he sounded uncertain. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation, perhaps. Her O2 levels are low, but functional, Creve reported. I think she's just resting. You don't rest in the crucible. You push forward, or you die. Nobody informed her of that, apparently. The human eventually stood, slowly, testing each movement. Then she did something no other participant had ever attempted. She started walking backward. The gravity decreased. Temperature stabilized. No, Pell whispered. She didn't. Didn't what? Zixthar demanded. The corridor is designed to force forward progression against increasing resistance. But the Kethrans built redundancy into everything. There's always an exit, always a choice. The corridor functions in both directions. Moving backward might take longer, but... On screen, the human was indeed moving backward, taking careful steps, occasionally glancing over her shoulder. It took her 3 times as long to cover the same distance, but she emerged into the 4th chamber, looking merely tired instead of half-dead. She cheated, someone said. She adapted, Pell corrected. There's a difference. The 4th chamber offered no immediate threat. Just a room. A simple room with a door on the far side. Between the human and that door, nothing visible. She stopped at the threshold, studying the empty space with narrowed eyes. Now she's learning caution, Mordak approved. This is the perception trap. Makes you see what isn't there, ignore what is. Most warriors charge through and trigger. The human tossed her stylus into the room. It vanished mid-flight, consumed by something invisible. The dimensional shear, yes, like that? So she's trapped, Zixthar said. Can't go forward, can't go back. Stalemate. The human sat down again, pulled out a ration bar, and started eating while staring at the empty room. 5 minutes passed. 10. The observers grew restless, checking their chronometers, recalculating odds. What is she waiting for? The Fen trader demanded. Krev was reviewing her biometric data with increasing fascination. She's not waiting. She's thinking. Look, at her brain activity. She's running scenarios, analyzing patterns. The Crucible showed her a room. She doesn't trust it, so she's figuring out what it actually is. 20 minutes in, the human stood. She walked to the left wall, placed her hand against it, then proceeded to walk along the perimeter of the chamber. Not entering the space, not retreating, just mapping the edges. The dimensional shear is anchored to specific coordinates, Pell realized. If she stays close to the walls... The human edged along the boundary, moving with exaggerated care, until she reached the far door. She pressed it open, slipped through, and was gone. The viewing chamber erupted in chaos. Accusations of malfunction, demands for rule clarifications, bitter recalculations of lost wagers. Pell silenced them with a gesture. She's not breaking the trial. She's treating it like a puzzle with multiple solutions. The Kethrans designed it to test warrior virtues, courage, strength, honor, but they never considered someone who views survival as an intellectual exercise rather than a moral imperative. 4 chambers cleared, Mordak said quietly. My people never made it past 3. What awaits her now? The screens flickered, loading the 5th chamber. This one was different, older looking, the technology more integrated with organic components. biomechanical hybrids that pulsed with something between life and function. The human entered, and the chamber sealed behind her with a finality that suggested no backward walking would help here. "Now," Pell said, her voice heavy with something between dread and curiosity. "Now she faces what we called the mirror of necessity. It learns who you are, then becomes what you cannot defeat." "And if you can't defeat it," someone asked, "then you die discovering your limitations." The human was examining the walls, those same walls that were beginning to shift, to reshape themselves into something new, something specific. The sensors detected massive data transfer, the chamber accessing her memories, her experiences, her deepest self, building something custom-made to end her. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "Okay," she said, setting down her pack and checking her plasma cutter. "Let's see what you've got." The chamber finished its calculations and presented its creation. Every observer leaned forward, and the human started laughing again, but this time it sounded different. Darker, like she'd just been told a joke she'd been waiting her whole life to hear. "Oh," she said, "you beautiful, stupid thing. You actually think that's going to work." What the chamber had created, none of the observers could quite see. The visual feed distorted around it, as if reality itself found the image difficult to process. But whatever it was, it had been drawn from the human's own mind, her own history, her own understanding of what she could not overcome. And she was walking toward it, still smiling, still taking notes. "This should be educational," she said. Then she disappeared into the distortion, and all the sensors went dark. The feed stayed black for 47 seconds. Long enough for 3 species to demand refunds, 2 to question whether the equipment had malfunctioned, and 1 to begin composing obituaries. Then the visual returned, and everyone wished it hadn't. The chamber had reconstructed itself into something that hurt to perceive. Angles that shouldn't exist, colors outside known spectrums, and at the center, a shape that the cameras refused to capture coherently. What appeared on screens looked different to each observer, filtering through their own species' neurological architecture to produce individualized nightmares. The human stood 3 meters from it, still holding her data pad, apparently unbothered by geometry that was giving half the viewing room nosebleeds. "Philosophical weapon," she was saying, circling the thing like a professor examining a student's thesis. "You've manifested the concept of my own irrelevance, the heat-death of meaning itself, the absolute certainty that nothing I do matters in the scope of cosmic indifference. Very Catherine, actually. They always did lean existential in their final war phases." Pell's translator was struggling with the human's terminology. "What is she describing?" "Depression," Krev said flatly. "Weaponized clinical depression given physical form. The chamber extracted her brain's own capacity for despair and turned it into a threat." "That's horrifying." "That's elegant," corrected a Tashal psychologist, who'd been silent until now, her 3 minds conferring rapidly. "Most warrior species fear external threats, death, pain, defeat. But humans possess this peculiar ability to create internal torment that surpasses any physical suffering. The trial recognized this and exploited it. She should be catatonic." The human reached out and touched the manifestation. Every alarm in the observation deck screamed warnings. Biometric data spiked across every category except the one that mattered. Her neural patterns showed engagement, not shutdown. Active thought, not surrender. "You're not wrong," she told the thing. "Objectively speaking, my existence is a statistical improbability that will be erased by entropy. Every relationship I build will end. Every accomplishment will crumble. The universe doesn't care about my survival, my happiness, or my entirely subjective belief that consciousness has value. She paused, considering. But here's the thing about subjective experience. It's the only kind I've got. The manifestation shifted, growing larger, pressing its reality against her mind with force that should have shattered her sense of self. She sat down cross-legged in front of it. You're trying to convince me that meaninglessness is defeat. But humans figured out something your Kethran programmers apparently didn't. Meaninglessness is liberation. If nothing matters, then I get to decide what matters to me. Right now, what matters is finishing this trial because I want to see what happens next. Tomorrow it might be something else entirely. That's not weakness. That's flexibility. She's negotiating with a psychological weapon, Mordak breathed, as if it were a person. She's reframing the attack, the Tashal psychologist corrected, all three of her minds focused now. The trial presents despair as an absolute truth. She's treating it as a perspective, a valid one, but merely one among many options. The manifestation pulsed, trying different approaches. The screens showed fragments of human memories, failures, losses, moments of profound humiliation and pain. A greatest hits collection of every reason someone might choose to stop existing. The human watched them like old photographs. Yeah, I remember these. Terrible day, that one. Oh, that breakup. Woof, that was messy. And this... She pointed at a memory of standing at the edge of something final, something that suggested she'd considered making different choices about her continued survival. That was a Tuesday, I think. Bad Tuesday. How is she not breaking? Someone whispered. Because she broke already, Pell said with sudden understanding. Before she ever came here. The trial assumes it's introducing psychological trauma. But humans, they carry their trauma with them, integrated into their identity. She's already survived her own despair. The chamber is just showing her old news. On screen, the human stood and dusted herself off. Look, I appreciate the effort. Really, top-tier psychological warfare. Your creators would be proud. But I've already had this conversation with myself about 1,000 times, and I'm still here. Not because I found some grand purpose or cosmic meaning, just because I decided that despite the absolute certainty of eventual oblivion, I'm curious about the next thing. And the thing after that. She picked up her plasma cutter. So if you're done with the motivational seminar on why I should give up, I've got doors to open. The manifestation didn't retreat. It couldn't. The trial wasn't designed to accept that outcome. Instead, it intensified, becoming something that registered on equipment as a localized reality collapse. The kind of phenomenon that should erase consciousness by overloading the brain's ability to construct coherent experience. The human walked straight into it. Sensors lost her for 12 seconds. When they regained signal, she was standing on the other side, looking slightly dizzy, but fundamentally intact. Transcendental experience, she reported to her datapad, voice unsteady but functional. Approximate sensation of ego death without actual death. 7 out of 10 would not recommend without proper preparation. She paused. Though I understand why the Kethrans thought that would work. If you've never experienced the total dissolution of self, having it forced on you would be catastrophic. But humans have been inducing ego death for recreational and spiritual purposes since we figured out which mushrooms to eat. We call it Tuesday, or sometimes college. The viewing room had gone silent again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was a kind of creeping horror as they realized what they were witnessing. She's not surviving the trial, Krev said slowly. She's demonstrating that her species has already done worse things to themselves than the Crucible could imagine. Every psychological weapon it deploys, humans have already weaponized against each other, or themselves. Evolutionary pressure, Pell murmured, her mind racing through historical databases. We designed the Crucible during our apex predator phase, when external threats shaped development. But humans, they evolved on a planet where the primary threat was other humans, and themselves. They've spent millennia perfecting the art of internal warfare. The chamber released her, perhaps recognizing futility, perhaps simply proceeding to the next phase. She emerged into a corridor that looked almost mundane by comparison, just a hallway with doors. 17 doors, specifically. The labyrinth of conviction, Mordak identified. Each door represents a choice between competing values. Behind one is survival. Behind the others, various forms of death or compromise. You must choose based on your deepest principles. The human examined the first door, then the second, then stopped bothering and started opening them randomly. Behind the first, vacuum exposure. Behind the second, a carnivorous plant species that dissolved organic matter. Behind the third, a philosophical argument about the nature of sacrifice that was supposed to paralyze decision-making. She closed that one quickly. Not doing homework right now, thanks. Fourth door, survival, but only if she abandoned her equipment. She moved on. Fifth door, a copy of herself, offering to split the trial. One could die, one could live, but she had to choose which. That's not even a real dilemma, she told her duplicate. We both know I'd choose to survive and you'd choose to survive, so this whole noble sacrifice setup doesn't work. Also, you're obviously not real because I don't stand like that. The duplicate looked offended before dissolving. Sixth door, temporal distortion. She'd experienced the next chamber in accelerated time, living years of trial in subjective experience, while minutes passed objectively. She considered this one longer. Tempting from a research perspective, but I'm already behind on sleep. Seventh door. Nothing, just a wall painted to look like a door. She laughed. Okay, that's just petty. She's mocking it, someone in the observation deck said unnecessarily. She's reducing it to absurdity, the Tashal psychologist corrected. By refusing to engage with the trial's moral framework, she's demonstrating that its power comes from participants accepting its rules. She's not playing. Then how does she proceed? Demanded Zixthar, who was watching enormous sums of money evaporate as odds recalculated themselves into meaninglessness. On screen, the human had stopped at door 13. She pressed her ear against it, listening. Airflow, she said. You're the real corridor, aren't you? The rest is theater. She opened it to reveal a passage leading downward, emergency lighting casting everything in red. One chamber left, Pell said, her voice hollow. The heart of necessity. Where my people, where we made our warriors choose between their identity and their survival. No tricks, no puzzles, just the simple question. Who are you willing to stop being in order to continue existing? And what happens to those who refuse to choose? Krev asked. They die. Or they emerge transformed into something other than what entered. Both outcomes were considered acceptable. The human descended the passage, and the lighting shifted from red to something older, more organic. The walls pulsed with bioluminescence that predated modern technology. Living architecture from when the Kethrans had blurred the line between construction and cultivation. She reached the final door. It was marked with symbols that translation programs couldn't parse, concepts that existed outside linguistic frameworks. She read them anyway, somehow. Beyond this point, what you are ends so that what you might become can begin, she translated. Heavy stuff. Also terrible life advice, but points for commitment to theme. She put her hand on the door. Final predictions? Zixthar called out, desperation in his voice. Anyone? Mordak shook his head slowly. I have no framework for this. She should have died 6 times over. She should have broken 4 times beyond that. Whatever happens next, we have no data. Then we're about to get some. Pell said. The human pushed open the door and stepped into the heart of necessity. The feeds didn't go dark this time. They showed everything. And what they showed made every observer question whether they understood humans at all. The heart of necessity was empty. Not empty like a vacant room. Empty like the concept of absence given architectural form. A space that existed purely to contain the confrontation between what someone was and what they feared losing. The human stood at the center, turning slowly, catalog-checking the void. "Huh," she said. Then something emerged from the emptiness, not manifested, not constructed. It had been there all along, woven into the fundamental nature of the chamber itself. The screens couldn't capture it directly, only its effects. Distortions in air pressure, temperature fluctuations spelling out patterns, shadows cast by light sources that didn't exist. It was a question, not spoken, not transmitted, but experienced directly in the architecture of thought itself. The observers couldn't hear it, but they saw the human respond. "That's not really how identity works for my species," she said, addressing the presence. "You're asking me to choose between core aspects of myself, curiosity versus survival, connection versus independence, logic versus emotion. But humans don't segment like that. We're just contradictions piled on top of each other until the stack gets tall enough to have opinions." The chamber pressed harder. Biometric data showed neurological stress beyond anything previously recorded. Not attacking her mind so much as demanding it make sense, fit into categories that could be evaluated and discarded. She resisted by refusing to simplify. "You want me to say I'd sacrifice my intellect to preserve my emotions, or vice versa, to claim I value survival over integrity, or the reverse. But here's what the Kethrans apparently never understood. Humans contain multitudes. I'm not one thing that might become another. I'm already 17 different things depending on the day, the mood, the blood sugar level." The presence intensified, trying to force coherence, to make her choose a singular identity so it could tear that identity away and observe what remained. She laughed. Not the dark amusement from earlier, but something gentler, almost sympathetic. "You can't unbuild me by removing pieces because I was never properly built in the first place. I'm a collection of barely compatible survival strategies that evolution duct-taped together and called a personality. Taking away parts doesn't reveal some essential core. It just leaves different combinations of the same chaos." The chamber shifted tactics. If it couldn't force her to choose what she was, it would force her to choose what she wasn't. The walls filled with alternatives, versions of herself making different choices, living different lives, becoming different people. Each one a path not taken, a self not realized, and it demanded she mourn them. "Oh, we're doing regret now." She watched the alternate lives flicker past. "The career I didn't pursue. The relationship I didn't fight for. The version of me who stayed home, who took risks, who chose safety, who chose adventure." She was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering. "Yeah, I wonder about those sometimes. Usually around 3 in the morning when sleep isn't happening." The chamber waited for the weight of unlived possibilities to crush her. Instead, she shrugged. "But I can't be all of them." "That's not tragedy. That's just math. Every choice eliminates alternatives. That's how time works. Getting philosophical about it doesn't change the fundamental structure of linear existence." She glanced at the nearest alternative self, one who'd apparently become a researcher instead of a mercenary. "Besides, that version looks bored. I made the right call." The alternative self flickered and vanished, and the human turned back to the central presence. "Is that it?" "Because I've got to say, for a final test, this is remarkably similar to garden-variety human introspection. We do this to ourselves every time we make major decisions. You're just forcing external what we do internally every day. The chamber made its ultimate move. It offered her peace. Not death, not surrender, actual peace. The cessation of internal conflict, the resolution of contradiction, the answer to every question she'd ever asked herself at 3 a.m, unity of purpose, clarity of identity, the end of wondering who she was supposed to be. All she had to do was let go of the uncertainty that humans called consciousness. The observers held their collective breath. "That's better," she admitted. "That's actually tempting. No more second-guessing, no more anxiety about whether I'm making the right choices, no more lying awake wondering if I'm wasting the one existence I get." She closed her eyes. Just certainty, direction, the comfort of knowing. Pell gripped the console. "She's considering it." "Can you blame her?" Krev whispered. "After everything we've seen, the constant analysis, the perpetual questioning, to be free of that burden." The human opened her eyes. "No thanks." The chamber recoiled. If a space could express surprise, this one did. "The uncertainty is the point," she explained. "The anxiety means I'm paying attention. The questions mean I'm still curious. You're offering me the psychological equivalent of death and calling it peace." She smiled. "I've met people who found that kind of certainty. They stopped growing, stopped adapting, became static in a universe that rewards change." She walked toward the far wall, where a door was beginning to materialize, not because the trial granted passage, but because it had run out of options. "Humans don't want to transcend our contradictions. We want to see what happens when we live with them. That's the whole project, staying curious about who we might become next." The door solidified. She opened it. On the other side was a simple exit tunnel, emergency lighting guiding the way to the surface. No more challenges, no final tricks. She'd won by refusing to compete. "Well," she said to the empty chamber, "thanks for the existential crisis. Already had 3 this month, but there's always room for one more." Then she left. The parlor erupted when she emerged into sub-level 9, still wearing that smile, her suit torn and stained with fluids from various chambers. Some hers, most not. She looked like she'd been chewed by machinery and spit out as an afterthought. She looked delighted. Zixthar was already calculating losses, his secondary brain in open rebellion against his primary. "The contract specifies full payout, yeah." She dropped her datapad on his counter. "Plus, I'm claiming the research documentation as mine. That's prime information about Kethrin trial design. Should fetch decent money from academic institutions." "You took notes," Mordak said, disbelief and something like respect warring in his voice. "Through the entire trial, you were taking notes." "Well, sure. Seemed wasteful not to. How often do you get access to functional ascendancy era technology?" She noticed his expression. "Oh, don't look at me like that. Your people treat trials as rites of passage. Mine treat them as learning opportunities. Different cultural values." Pell approached slowly, studying the human with new eyes. "You weren't trying to survive." "Not really." "Of course I was." "No, survival was incidental. You were trying to understand. The trial, the Kethrins, yourself. You were conducting an experiment where the hypothesis was whether you'd live through it. The human considered this. Little column A, little column B. Mostly I was curious if your ancestors had figured out something about consciousness that mine hadn't. Turns out..." She glanced back at the entrance to the crucible. "They got close. Built some interesting tools, but they were asking the wrong questions." "And the right questions are?" "Not, who should you be, or what should you become? Just, what do you want to do next?" She collected her winnings. Her ship's deed returned. plus considerable profit from the house odds. Because the next thing is always coming, whether you've got yourself figured out or not. Might as well enjoy the confusion. Krev was still reviewing the biometric data, shaking his head at readings that shouldn't have been survivable. Your species is terrifying. Our species is persistent, she corrected. There's a difference. Terrifying implies we're trying to scare you. We're just trying to see what happens if we keep going. She bought a round for everyone, even those who'd bet against her, and spent the next hour answering questions about Earth, humanity, and why her people seemed constitutionally incapable of recognizing when they should quit. It's not bravery, she explained to a Than merchant. Bravery implies understanding the danger and proceeding anyway. We're usually too busy being curious about the danger to properly process the fear part. By the time we realize we should be terrified, we're already halfway through whatever stupid thing we decided to try. But the trial, pressed the Vryn delegate, still bitter about lost wagers. You understood it was designed to kill you. Sure, but it was also designed by a civilization that doesn't exist anymore, which made me wonder what they got wrong. Turns out, she grinned, they assumed everyone wants the same things. Unity, purpose, transcendence, never considered that some species might prefer the mess. As the gathering dispersed, Pell caught her at the doorway. The crucible will remain active. Others will attempt it. Good. Competition drives innovation. Maybe someone will actually figure out how to beat it properly instead of just, she gestured vaguely, annoying it into submission. Is that what you did? The human paused, thinking it over. I refuse to let it define the terms of engagement. Your people built it to test warriors. I'm not a warrior. I'm just someone who doesn't like being told what's impossible. She pulled out her datapad, already composing something. Speaking of which, I should probably report this to the Terran Diplomatic Corps. They'll want to know about the trial, though I'm leaving out the parts that might encourage others to try it. You don't want humans to attempt the crucible? Oh, they'll attempt it anyway once word gets out. We're predictable like that. Tell us something's deadly and we start planning expeditions. She smiled. But I can at least delay the inevitable by making the paperwork complicated. She left then, walking through the hollow nexus like someone who hadn't just survived what 94% of participants couldn't. Behind her, the observers began updating their databases, adding new entries to the growing file on humanity. Zixthar watched her go, his financial losses temporarily forgotten. What do we tell the next warrior who wants to attempt the crucible? Pell was silent for a long moment, considering. Tell them that the trial remains undefeated, because what the human did, that wasn't victory. That was something outside the framework of winning or losing. She simply refused to play the game as intended and walked away when she got bored with the alternatives. That's worse than losing, Mordak muttered. Or better, Krev suggested. Depends on your perspective. Very human, Pell agreed. The feeds from the crucible flickered one last time before going dormant, waiting for the next participant. Somewhere in its ancient programming, perhaps, it was recalibrating, adding new parameters, adjusting expectations, trying to account for species that approached cosmic trials with academic interest and casual defiance. But probably not. The Kithrans had built it to be absolute, immutable, perfect in its purpose. They just never met someone who considered perfection less interesting than finding out what happened when you poked it with a stick. 3 stations away, the human was already composing messages home, explaining that she'd be late for her next cargo run because she'd gotten sidetracked by interesting alien death trap, very educational, learned lots about extinct civilizations' approach to psychological warfare, would recommend with reservations. She attached her research notes. She didn't mention the smile she couldn't quite shake, or the way her hand still trembled slightly from adrenaline she hadn't bothered to process while inside the trial. She definitely didn't mention the moment in the heart of necessity when she'd actually considered accepting that offer of peace. 30 seconds of genuine temptation before deciding that uncertainty was more valuable than comfort. Some things, she'd learned, you kept to yourself. Not because they were shameful, but because they were human. And explaining human to non-humans was exhausting. Better to just demonstrate and let them draw their own conclusions. She fired off the messages, checked her navigation charts, and plotted course for the outer colonies. The grain shipment was waiting, boring and safe, and exactly what she'd been avoiding when she took the bet. She couldn't wait to get back to it. Not because she'd learned anything profound about herself, or discovered some grand purpose. Just because she was curious about what came next, and what came after that. And really, when you got down to it, wasn't that reason enough? The stars didn't answer. They never did, but she hadn't expected them to. She just liked asking anyway.